The most dangerous people aren't the ones who scream the loudest. They're the ones who smile while stealing something they were never entitled to. I didn't fully understand how true those words were until the morning a woman in a spotless white polo shirt tried to fine me $5,000 for casting a fishing line into the same lake where my father had taught me to bait a hook 30 years earlier. The mist still floated low across the water when I eased my aluminum boat against the old cedar dock. The smell of wet pine mixed with fresh lake water drifted through the cool mountain air, the kind of scent that instantly slows your heartbeat if you've spent enough years trapped behind office walls and city traffic. A loon called somewhere across the lake, followed by nothing but silence and the soft tap of tiny waves against weathered wood. That silence lasted exactly 12 seconds. The sharp crunch of expensive SUV tires rolled across the gravel driveway behind my cabin. A car door slammed hard enough to send a flock of blackbirds exploding from the trees. Before I even turned around, I heard the unmistakable rhythm of confident footsteps coming down the dock, heels clicking against old cedar boards like someone walking into a courtroom they already believed they owned. "You can reel that line in now," a woman's voice barked behind me. "You're committing an HOA violation." I looked over my shoulder without standing. 3 people were walking toward me. The woman in front couldn't have been younger than 50. Perfect blonde hair, designer sunglasses, white golf visor, a leather folder tucked beneath one arm like it contained the Constitution itself. 2 private security guards followed several steps behind her, wearing matching polo shirts embroidered with the neighborhood HOA logo. One of them already held a clipboard. The other carried a handheld camera aimed directly at me. I slowly lifted my coffee mug instead of my fishing rod. "Morning," I said. She ignored the greeting completely. "My name is Linda Prescott, president of Eagle Ridge Lake Association." She opened her folder with theatrical precision. "You have been observed fishing without HOA authorization. Under Section 8 of our Recreational Covenant, you are hereby fined $5,000 effective immediately." $5,000. For fishing. I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, because sometimes your brain refuses to process something that absurd any other way. The sound echoed across the calm water, and for a split second, I caught the irritated twitch at the corner of her mouth. She wasn't used to people laughing at her. "Is something amusing, sir?" she asked, tightening her grip on the paperwork. I set my coffee down beside my tackle box and finally stood. The old dock creaked beneath my boots while the morning breeze carried the scent of cedar needles through the air. Everything about the lake still felt peaceful. Everything except the woman standing 20 feet away pretending she owned it. "I've been fishing here since I was 10 years old," I replied. "Then you've been violating community policy for a very long time," she answered without hesitation. One security guard stepped closer, angling the camera higher toward my face. The other pulled out a printed citation already filled in except for my signature. That told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't an investigation. This wasn't even about fishing. The decision had been made before they arrived. They weren't here to ask questions. They were here to make an example out of someone. Around the shoreline, curtains shifted inside neighboring cabins. People were watching. Nobody stepped outside. Nobody said a word. They simply watched another confrontation unfold, just like they probably had dozens of times before. Linda held out the citation. "Sign here acknowledging receipt. Refusal to cooperate will result in additional penalties, suspension of lake access, and notification to the county sheriff." Her smile finally appeared. It wasn't warm. It wasn't friendly. It was the smile of someone who had never been told no often enough in life. I looked from the citation to the lake, then to the old metal tackle box resting quietly beside my boots. Inside that scratched green box, buried beneath spare hooks, fishing weights, and a faded photograph of my father holding the first trout I ever caught, rested something Linda Prescott couldn't possibly imagine. She thought she had arrived to teach a stubborn cabin owner a lesson. What she didn't know was that before this morning ended, every word she had just spoken would become evidence, and the smallest piece of metal inside that tackle box carried more legal authority than every HOA rule she had spent years hiding behind. People always assume a badge changes a man. The truth is, it doesn't. It simply reveals who was pretending to have authority all along. I never carried my badge because I wanted special treatment. Most days, it stayed exactly where it belonged, tucked inside an old leather wallet beneath a faded photograph of my father standing knee-deep in this very lake with a stringer full of rainbow trout. That picture was taken in the summer of 1994. I was 9 years old, missing my 2 front teeth and grinning so hard my cheeks hurt. Dad always said fish could smell impatience before they could smell bait. "Slow down, Ethan," he'd laugh while the morning fog drifted over the water. The lake doesn't reward people who rush. Back then, this place didn't belong to any association. There were no decorative entrance gates, no matching mailboxes, no laminated rulebooks thicker than a hunting catalog. Just mountains, pine trees, and Crystal Ridge Lake stretching across nearly 600 acres of public water managed by the state for everyone willing to respect it. Our cabin sat on a narrow piece of privately owned shoreline my grandfather bought after returning from Korea in 1956. He built every inch of it himself with cedar logs hauled from the surrounding forest and stones collected from the creek behind the property. Even now, 70 years later, the front porch still groaned under heavy boots exactly the way it had when Grandpa came home carrying venison over one shoulder. The smell inside never changed either. Old cedar, coffee grounds, lantern oil, the faint scent of lake water soaked into generations of wooden floorboards. To most people, it looked like an outdated fishing cabin. To me, it was the only place in the world that had never lied. My career wasn't something I had planned as a kid. I thought I'd become a carpenter like Grandpa, or maybe a fishing guide like Dad joked I should. Then Dad died from a heart attack 3 weeks before my 23rd birthday. Clearing out his workshop, I found stacks of wildlife journals, handwritten notes about fish populations, migration routes, nesting seasons, and letters he'd exchanged with state conservation officers over nearly 20 years. He cared about this lake far more deeply than I'd ever realized. That discovery quietly changed the direction of my life. I enrolled in the academy, survived months of field training, learned wildlife law, environmental investigations, search and rescue operations, boating enforcement, and more state regulations than most attorneys ever cared to read. 15 years later, I had worked everything from illegal trophy poaching to commercial pollution cases worth millions of dollars. Yet whenever my vacation days came around, I always returned here. Not because it was part of my patrol district, it wasn't, but because this dock reminded me why I had accepted the badge in the first place. Protect the resource. Protect the people who respected it. Everything else was paperwork. Things began changing about 4 years earlier when Eagle Ridge Estates expanded around the western shoreline. Massive homes replaced old cabins. Luxury pontoons replaced aluminum fishing boats. Realtors started describing the lake as an exclusive waterfront lifestyle instead of what it actually was, a public natural resource governed by state law. New neighbors arrived every month carrying designer kayaks they barely used and opinions they hadn't earned. Then came Linda Prescott. She wasn't originally from these mountains. Rumors said she'd retired after decades selling luxury real estate in Scottsdale before moving here with her husband. Within 6 months, she'd become HOA president. Within a year, she somehow convinced half the neighborhood that preserving property values required controlling everything people could see, hear, or enjoy. New signs appeared almost overnight. Private HOA dock. Resident access only. Authorized recreation permit required. They looked official enough that tourists believed them. Even some longtime residents started second-guessing their own rights. Every few weeks I'd hear another story at the local bait shop. Somebody's grandson chased away for fishing. An elderly veteran warned not to launch his canoe. A teenager threatened with trespassing while photographing bald eagles. Most folks simply apologized and left. They assumed the woman holding the clipboard knew the law better than they did. Standing on my father's dock that morning, watching Linda wave a $5,000 citation inches from my face, I realized something that made the cold mountain air feel suddenly heavier. She wasn't just inventing rules anymore. She genuinely believed she owned the lake. And people had believed her for so long that they had forgotten who actually did. Bullies rarely begin with their biggest lie. They start with little ones, repeated often enough that everyone eventually mistakes them for the truth. Linda Prescott didn't become the unofficial queen of Crystal Ridge Lake overnight. She built her kingdom one intimidation at a time. While she stood on my dock waving a $5,000 citation like she'd just caught a hardened criminal, I found myself remembering the first time I'd heard her name. It was almost 2 years earlier inside Murphy's Bait and Tackle, a tiny weathered shop 3 miles down the mountain road, where fishermen still paid in cash, and everyone knew everyone else's truck. Old Frank Murphy was pouring coffee into chipped ceramic mugs when an elderly couple walked in looking frustrated. "Guess we're driving to Pine Hollow instead," the husband muttered. Frank frowned. "Why?" The man shrugged. "HOA lady says non-residents can't fish Crystal Ridge anymore unless we buy one of their permits." Frank nearly dropped the coffee pot. "Since when does an HOA own state water?" The couple simply shook their heads. She had signs everywhere. Didn't seem worth arguing. That conversation stuck with me because I knew exactly how public access laws worked. But Crystal Ridge wasn't my assigned district, and unless someone filed a formal complaint, there wasn't much reason for me to step into another region's routine neighborhood disputes. Looking back now, that was Linda's greatest advantage. She understood something most people didn't. If you blur the line between confidence and legality, people stop asking questions. A month later, another story surfaced. A father had taken his 8-year-old daughter to the public launch ramp on the Western Shore. Linda confronted them before they even unloaded their canoe. According to witnesses, she claimed the HOA had exclusive recreational authority over the lake and threatened to have their vehicle towed if they didn't leave immediately. They packed up without a fight. Nobody wanted to spend a Saturday arguing with an angry woman carrying a clipboard. Then came the paddleboard rentals. A local high school teacher started renting paddleboards during summer break to make extra money. Linda reported him for unauthorized commercial activity, even though he operated entirely from county-owned shoreline outside HOA property. The teacher shut his business down after receiving 3 certified letters filled with legal language that sounded terrifying if you didn't know better. The strange part wasn't that she kept making these claims. It was how many people believed her. Wealth has a funny way of creating invisible authority. Linda dressed like success, spoke like an attorney, drove a brand new Range Rover, and never hesitated when she quoted sections from the HOA handbook. Most folks assumed someone that confident must know what they were talking about. They never bothered separating HOA rules from actual state law. By the second summer, Eagle Ridge Lake Association had transformed from a neighborhood organization into something far stranger. Decorative gates appeared near walking trails that had always been open. Laminated maps marked portions of shoreline as members only. Volunteers wearing matching polo shirts began patrolling docks with radios clipped to their belts. They weren't law enforcement. They weren't conservation officers. They weren't county employees. But tourists couldn't tell the difference. Frank Murphy once joked they looked like mall security pretending to be Navy SEALs. Underneath the laughter, though, I sensed genuine concern. Business at his bait shop had dropped nearly 30% because visitors believed the lake had become private. Local guides complained about canceled bookings. Families stopped bringing children to fish from the public piers because they didn't want to be harassed. Every new restriction existed for one purpose: to make ordinary people feel like outsiders in a place that legally belonged to everyone. Standing on my dock that morning, I watched Linda continue her performance. "Failure to comply will increase the penalty," she announced loudly enough for nearby cabins to hear. "Additional enforcement measures may become necessary." Enforcement measures. The phrase rolled off her tongue so naturally you'd think she'd spent years saying it. One of the security guards shifted closer, his radio crackling softly against his shoulder. I noticed he never looked me in the eye. The younger one holding the camera seemed nervous too. He kept glancing toward Linda before every movement, waiting for silent approval like a rookie actor afraid of missing his cue. They weren't confident. They were conditioned. Around the shoreline, cabin doors opened a few inches farther. Faces appeared behind screened porches. I recognized several longtime residents. Every one of them looked uncomfortable. Not surprised. Not shocked. Just tired. That told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't the first public humiliation Linda had staged. It was simply the first time she'd chosen the wrong target. She thought she was protecting property values. In reality, she'd spent years building a case against herself. One fabricated rule, one frightened family, and one illegal threat at a time. She simply hadn't realized someone had finally arrived who understood exactly where HOA authority ended and where state law began. The moment a crowd gathers, people stop performing for the truth. They start performing for the audience. Linda understood that better than anyone. She took one slow step closer, extending the citation until it nearly touched my chest. "Mr. Walker, this is your final opportunity to cooperate voluntarily." Her voice had changed. It was louder now, carefully projected toward the cabins surrounding the shoreline. She wasn't speaking to me anymore. She was speaking to every pair of eyes watching from screen porches and second-story windows. Failure to sign this citation, she continued, will result in additional fines, suspension of all community privileges, and immediate involvement of county law enforcement. I glanced toward the nearest cabin. An older man I recognized as Bill Hansen stood frozen beside his grill, spatula still in one hand. His wife gently tugged on his sleeve as if silently reminding him not to get involved. Across the cove, a teenage boy lowered his fishing rod and stared in my direction. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. Fear has a strange sound. Sometimes it sounds exactly like silence. I looked back at Linda. I'm curious, I said evenly. Which law says I need HOA permission to fish here? Her smile tightened for the briefest moment. It was almost invisible, but years of interviewing poachers had taught me to recognize the split second when confidence gives way to improvisation. She opened her folder and flipped through several laminated pages. Section 8 of the Eagle Ridge Recreational Covenant. That's an HOA covenant, I replied. I asked which law. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she nodded toward one of the guards. Mark, continue recording. The younger guard adjusted the camera, moving even closer until the lens was only a few feet from my face. For legal documentation, Linda announced. The homeowner is refusing compliance. Homeowner, not trespasser, not criminal. She had just unintentionally acknowledged that I owned the property beneath my feet. Small detail, important detail. I filed it away without saying a word. You realize, she continued, that this lake is maintained by our association? I almost smiled. Maintained. Our residents fund the shoreline improvements, dock inspections, and recreational oversight. Interesting. Do you find this amusing? She snapped. No, I answered calmly. I find word choice fascinating. Her expression hardened. Bullies hate calm people. Anger feeds them. Calm forces them to keep talking, and the longer they talk, the more mistakes they make. She took another step onto my dock without asking permission. Since you refuse to cooperate, I'm authorizing immediate seizure of any equipment used during this violation until your hearing before the HOA board. One of the guards hesitated. Ma'am, take the fishing rod. The guard looked from Linda to me. He didn't move. Ma'am, are we allowed to do that? I said take it. He swallowed hard before reluctantly reaching toward the rod leaning against the railing. I simply watched. My hands stayed at my sides. My breathing never changed. As his fingers wrapped around the cork handle, I noticed something else. The small body camera clipped to his polo shirt blinked with a steady blue light. Recording. Good. Very good. Linda apparently hadn't noticed it. And the boat, she added. We'll have it towed if necessary. I slowly looked at my 16-foot aluminum fishing boat tied to the dock. It was older than most of the houses in Eagle Ridge. My father and I had rebuilt its engine together during high school. Every scratch on its hull had a memory attached to it. You're ordering someone to seize private property? I asked. Property used in violation of HOA regulations. Without a court order? We don't need one. The words floated across the water like an echo. Several neighbors shifted uncomfortably. Even Bill Hansen lowered his eyes. Linda had crossed another line, and this time everyone heard it. She didn't notice because she was already reaching for her phone. Since you're choosing this route, she said, I'll contact the sheriff personally. I know people at the department. She tapped the screen dramatically before placing the phone against her ear. Whether she actually knew anyone didn't matter. The performance did. Every gesture was designed to convince the audience that she possessed unlimited authority. As she spoke into the phone, I quietly studied the scene around me. The security guard's body camera. The handheld video camera. Half a dozen neighbors watching from different angles. 3 smartphones now visible behind porch railings. At least 4 independent witnesses. Morning sunlight reflecting across perfectly still water. No shouting from me. No threats. No resistance. Just a woman voluntarily creating an increasingly detailed record of her own decisions. She believed she was building a case against a stubborn fisherman. In reality, she was constructing something far more dangerous. Every sentence she spoke, every order she gave, every unlawful claim she made, they weren't disappearing into the mountain air. They were becoming evidence. I have learned that the hardest part of enforcing the law isn't memorizing statutes or chasing criminals through the woods. It's resisting the urge to interrupt someone who is busily destroying their own case. Linda ended her phone call with a satisfied smile before slipping the device back into her pocket. The sheriff's office has been notified, she announced proudly. A deputy is on the way. She said it like a judge delivering a final sentence. Around us, I noticed another curtain move inside one of the lakeside homes. More people had come outside now. Some leaned against porch railings. Others stood beside golf carts parked near the shoreline. Nobody spoke above a whisper, but the atmosphere had changed. What began as a quiet morning had become the neighborhood's entertainment. Linda mistook their curiosity for support. I recognized it for what it really was. People were waiting to see whether someone would finally stand up to her. You still have one opportunity to resolve this peacefully, she said. Sign the citation, surrender your fishing equipment, and attend the HOA disciplinary hearing next Thursday. I folded my arms. And if I don't, then the consequences become much more expensive. For who? The question slipped out before I could stop myself. She frowned. Excuse me. Nothing, I replied with an easy shrug. Just thinking out loud. That seemed to irritate her even more than arguing would have. Bullies depend on emotional reactions. When they don't get one, they start creating bigger scenes to force one. Right on schedule, Linda stepped farther down my dock until she was standing less than 6 feet away. Mark, she said without taking her eyes off me, photograph the registration numbers on the boat. The older security guard hesitated. Ma'am, it's tied to private property. Did I stutter? He sighed quietly and walked toward the stern of my boat. As he leaned over to photograph the registration decals, I watched him carefully avoid touching anything. Unlike Linda, he understood there was a line he didn't want to cross. The younger guard wasn't nearly as cautious. He kept circling me with the handheld camera, narrating into the microphone as though filming a television documentary. Subject is refusing HOA compliance. He muttered. Subject remains uncooperative. Subject, not homeowner, not resident, not citizen, just a subject. Funny how language exposes the way people think. Linda cleared her throat dramatically. Since you're refusing to identify yourself properly, I'll need your driver's license immediately. I blinked once. Why? For the citation. You already know my name. Procedure. Whose procedure? She opened her mouth, then closed it again. Another pause. Another improvisation. Association procedure. Is there a written policy? Silence. Can I see it? More silence. I could almost hear gears turning inside her head. Every answer I gave sounded like a simple question, but each one quietly boxed her into a corner. She wasn't accustomed to people asking where her authority actually came from. Most simply assumed it existed. A breeze swept across the lake, carrying the scent of fresh pine and cool water over the dock. Somewhere behind the cabins, a wind chime rang softly. It reminded me of something my academy instructor used to repeat during interview training. The person who talks the most usually loses. I had watched that lesson prove itself hundreds of times. Illegal hunters explaining why the rifle wasn't theirs. Polluters inventing stories that contradicted security footage. Fraud suspects volunteering details nobody had asked about. Guilt often speaks louder than evidence. Linda kept speaking. Our association has invested hundreds of thousands of dollars protecting this lake. Another statement. Another claim. We've worked closely with county officials. Interesting. The sheriff fully supports our enforcement efforts. Even more interesting. Anyone who challenges HOA authority challenges the entire community. That one nearly made me smile. The entire community? I glanced around the shoreline again. Bill Hansen wasn't nodding. The young family on the neighboring dock certainly wasn't cheering. An elderly woman sitting beneath a blue patio umbrella slowly shook her head before disappearing back inside her cabin. Linda had become so convinced that she represented everyone that she no longer noticed when everyone stopped following her. Then I heard it. Faint at first. Tires humming against the mountain road beyond the trees. Not fast. Not urgent. Just steady. A vehicle climbing the last hill toward the lake. The older security guard heard it too. He lowered his camera for the first time since arriving. Linda straightened her shoulders and smiled confidently. Perfect timing, she whispered. Now you'll learn how seriously the county takes HOA violations. I looked toward the gravel entrance without moving another inch. The approaching engine grew louder with every passing second. Linda thought reinforcements were coming for me. I knew something far more important was about to arrive. And for the first time that morning, I almost felt sorry for her. I have seen men pull rifles on wardens. I have watched smugglers flee into frozen rivers. I have stood between angry crowds and frightened children during wildfire evacuations. Yet nothing compares to the expression on a person's face when they suddenly realize they have spent the last hour threatening someone they never bothered to identify. The county patrol SUV rolled into the gravel parking area and came to a smooth stop beneath the towering pines. The engine fell silent. A deputy stepped out, adjusted his duty belt, and glanced toward the gathering crowd before walking calmly down the path leading to my dock. Linda straightened immediately, smoothing invisible wrinkles from her white polo shirt. "Deputy," she called with obvious relief. "Thank goodness you're here. This homeowner has refused to comply with multiple HOA enforcement actions." The deputy nodded politely but didn't answer. He continued walking until he reached the edge of the dock. I recognized him before he recognized me. Deputy Aaron Mitchell. We'd crossed paths several times during joint search and rescue operations over the years. Good officer. Careful. Observant. Not someone who rushed to conclusions. "Morning," he said, looking first at Linda, then at me. "What's going on?" Linda stepped forward before I could open my mouth. "This individual has been fishing illegally, refused to surrender identification, ignored a lawful HOA citation, obstructed our enforcement officers, and is now refusing to vacate recreational property under association control." It was an impressive speech. Nearly everything she said was either exaggerated or completely false. Aaron listened without interrupting. Then he turned toward me. "Sir." I smiled faintly. "Morning, Aaron." He squinted for half a second. Recognition slowly replaced confusion. "Ethan, been a while." His eyebrows lifted. "Yeah, it has." Linda quickly stepped between us. "Deputy, I'd appreciate it if you would have him sign this citation immediately." Aaron didn't take the paperwork. Instead, he looked back at me. "Mind telling me your side?" I glanced toward the old green tackle box resting beside my coffee mug. The same battered metal box my father had carried on this lake for decades. The same box Linda had ignored all morning because, to her, it looked like nothing more than rusted fishing gear. I bent down slowly. One security guard instinctively stiffened, but Aaron raised a hand without taking his eyes off me. "It's fine." I opened the tackle box. The familiar scent of old metal, soft plastic bait, and lake water drifted upward. Hooks, sinkers, extra fishing line. My father's faded photograph. Beneath it rested a worn brown leather credential wallet. I picked it up with one hand and flipped it open. The gold badge caught the morning sunlight before I said a single word. State Game Warden. Deputy Aaron Mitchell's posture changed instantly. His shoulders straightened. His expression became professional in a way only another law enforcement officer would recognize. "Morning, Warden Walker," he said evenly. "Didn't realize you were off duty today." I nodded once. Vacation. Complete silence swept across the dock. Even the wind seemed to stop. Behind Linda, the younger security guard slowly lowered his camera. The older guard stared at the badge without blinking. Somewhere across the shoreline, someone whispered, "He's a game warden." Linda didn't move. She simply stared at the credential wallet as though her brain refused to process what her eyes were seeing. Finally, she laughed once. It sounded forced. "Well, that's completely irrelevant." Nobody answered. Aaron looked at her, then back at me. "Want to explain?" I closed the wallet but kept it in my hand. I was fishing from private shoreline connected to public water with a valid state license. Mrs. Prescott issued a $5,000 HOA citation, ordered my equipment seized, claimed authority over state-managed waters, attempted to restrict lawful public access, demanded identification without legal basis, and threatened additional enforcement if I refused to comply. Aaron slowly turned toward Linda. "Ma'am, did you order someone to seize his fishing equipment?" She hesitated. "Just for a second. Our association permits us to enforce." "That's not what I asked." The dock became so quiet I could hear water dripping from the side of my boat. Linda looked around, searching for support that no longer existed. The neighbors who had remained silent all morning were still watching. Only now they weren't watching me. Every eye had shifted toward her. The performance was over. The audience had finally learned who actually understood the law. And the most important part hadn't even begun yet. Power changes direction faster than the wind when the facts finally enter the conversation. One moment Linda Prescott was standing at the center of the dock like a queen issuing royal decrees. The next, every person there was waiting for her to explain where that authority had actually come from. She never did. Deputy Mitchell looked at me with the quiet expression officers share when they realize a routine call has become something entirely different. "Warden," he asked, "would you like me to document this as an incident?" I nodded once. "Yes, but before you do, I'd like to establish a few facts while everyone who witnessed them is still here." Linda finally found her voice again. "This is ridiculous. He's abusing his position." I looked directly at her for the first time since opening my credential wallet. "No, Mrs. Prescott. I'm using my training." The difference mattered. I stepped toward the edge of the dock and slowly turned to face the gathering neighbors. More than 20 people had wandered closer during the last several minutes. Some held coffee mugs. Others still wore slippers. A little girl sat on her father's shoulders so she could see over the crowd. Nobody was laughing anymore. "Deputy," I said calmly, "did you hear Mrs. Prescott state that her association controls recreational access to this lake?" "I did." "Did you hear her order private security personnel to seize fishing equipment?" "Yes." "Did you hear her state they didn't need a court order?" He nodded again. "Yes." Linda's face lost a little more color. I continued before she could interrupt. "Mark." The older security guard looked startled when I called him by the name stitched onto his shirt. "Your body camera has been recording this entire interaction, correct?" He hesitated before answering. "Yes, sir." "And the handheld camera?" The younger guard swallowed. "Still recording." "Excellent." Linda spun toward both men. "Turn those off." Neither moved. Deputy Mitchell quietly cleared his throat. "Don't." They froze exactly where they stood. I walked to the beginning of the dock where several freshly installed aluminum signs overlooked the shoreline. One bright blue sign read, "Private Lake. HOA members only." Another warned that unauthorized fishing could result in fines and removal. I pointed toward them. "Deputy, would you mind taking photographs?" "Of course." As he began documenting the signs, I spoke loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. Crystal Ridge Lake is state-managed public water. These signs represent restrictions that do not exist under state regulation. I shifted toward the floating dock beside mine. "Those permit requirement notices?" Another photograph. "Those unauthorized fine schedules?" Click. "Those warnings claiming exclusive recreational jurisdiction?" Another click echoed across the quiet water. Every photograph represented another piece of evidence. Linda folded her arms tightly across her chest. "Our attorneys approved every one of those signs." "Maybe," I answered. "Or maybe someone simply told you what you wanted to hear." Her jaw tightened. "You're trying to intimidate me." I shook my head. "No. Intimidation is threatening families with imaginary authority until they stop using public land. Documentation is something else entirely." A murmur spread through the neighbors. Bill Hansen stepped forward for the first time all morning. "She's chased my grandson off this dock twice," he said quietly. An elderly woman raised her hand. "She told my husband we'd be arrested for launching our canoe." Another voice came from the back. "They charged my nephew $200 for a lake permit last summer." Then another, and another. The stories poured out like water breaking through a cracked dam. Years of silence disappeared in less than 2 minutes because someone had finally made people feel safe enough to speak. Linda looked around in disbelief. "Why didn't any of you say something before?" Bill answered without anger. "Because nobody thought anyone would believe us." Those words hung in the mountain air longer than anything else spoken that morning. I looked back toward Deputy Mitchell. His notebook was already half full. The security guards had stopped pretending they were conducting an enforcement operation. They now stood quietly beside their equipment, looking less like officers and more like employees wondering whether they should have accepted a different job. I closed my tackle box and rested one hand on its weathered lid. My father's photograph was safely back inside beneath the badge. Somehow that felt appropriate. He had always taught me that protecting a lake meant protecting the people who belonged there too. Linda believed authority came from laminated rulebooks, expensive lawyers, and loud public performances. She was about to discover that real authority begins with something much harder to manufacture: the truth. And once the truth starts speaking through witnesses, cameras, and evidence, there isn't a single HOA bylaw in America powerful enough to silence it. Justice almost never arrives with flashing lights or dramatic speeches. Most of the time, it arrives inside an evidence folder, one page at a time. 3 weeks after that morning on the dock, I drove back to Crystal Ridge, not with a fishing rod in my hand, but with a stack of inspection reports riding in the passenger seat. The summer heat had settled over the mountains, replacing the cool morning mist with the scent of sun-warmed pine needles and fresh-cut grass. The lake looked exactly the same. The people living around it did not. The unauthorized signs were already gone. Empty post holes remained where bright blue warning boards had once stood, as if someone hoped removing them would erase the months of intimidation they represented. It doesn't work that way. Evidence has an inconvenient habit of surviving long after the props disappear. The investigation moved far beyond a neighborhood disagreement. Once the recorded footage from the security guards, Deputy Mitchell's incident report, and multiple witness statements were collected, every agency that needed to review the matter had enough information to begin asking uncomfortable questions. The body camera alone captured more than enough. Linda ordering private property seized. Linda claiming authority over public water. Linda threatening enforcement powers her association simply did not possess. Then came the financial records. Several homeowners voluntarily provided copies of receipts for so-called recreational permits and access fees they had been pressured into paying over the previous 2 summers. Others produced warning letters carrying official-looking language that implied legal consequences no HOA could lawfully impose. The pattern became impossible to ignore. It wasn't one misunderstanding. It wasn't one overly aggressive conversation. It was a system. A carefully repeated system built on the assumption that nobody would ever challenge it. Bill Hansen called me a week after investigators visited his cabin. "You'll appreciate this," he said, laughing harder than I'd ever heard him laugh. Turns out Linda kept every complaint anyone ever filed against her. Seriously? Color-coded binders. I couldn't help smiling. That saves everyone a lot of work. She documented her own history. Some people do. During interviews, neighbors who had remained silent for years suddenly found their voices. The elderly couple from Murphy's bait shop described being chased away from the public shoreline. The teacher who had abandoned his paddleboard business produced certified letters threatening legal action. Families shared photographs of children standing beside signs, falsely claiming the lake was private property. Piece by piece, the picture became complete. The investigation no longer centered on me. It centered on everyone who had quietly accepted treatment they never should have tolerated. I returned to Murphy's bait and tackle one afternoon after filing my final supplemental report. Frank looked up from behind the register with a grin stretching beneath his gray mustache. "Coffee. Always." He poured 2 cups before leaning across the counter. "Business is up." "Good." Tourists came back. Through the front window, I watched 2 teenagers buying fishing licenses while an older couple asked about the best shoreline for catching trout. Something as simple as accurate information had restored confidence people didn't even realize they'd lost. "Funny thing," Frank said, stirring his coffee. "Nobody ever owned this lake." "No," I replied. "Some people just acted like they did." A few days later, I drove past Eagle Ridge one final time before heading home. Workers were replacing the old sign near the entrance. The words "Exclusive Lake Community" had disappeared. In their place stood a modest wooden marker with nothing more than the neighborhood's name carved into cedar. No warnings. No threats. No imaginary authority. Just a sign. As I slowed near the public boat launch, I noticed something that made me smile. Bill Hansen stood beside his grandson, helping the little boy untangle a fishing line. Nearby, the young family I'd seen watching from their porch was unloading kayaks without anyone questioning them. An elderly couple eased a canoe into the water while laughing at something only they could hear. Nobody asked for permits. Nobody demanded identification. Nobody carried clipboards. The lake had not changed. The law had not changed. Only fear had disappeared. I parked for a moment beside the shoreline and listened. Wind brushing through tall pines. Waves tapping gently against the dock. A child cheering after catching a small bluegill. Those sounds had always belonged here. They had simply been drowned out for a while by someone who confused control with leadership. In the end, Linda Prescott didn't lose because I carried a badge. She lost because every false claim she ever made eventually collided with something stronger than confidence, louder than intimidation, and far more permanent than an HOA handbook. She collided with the truth. People often ask me what happened to Linda Prescott after everything was over. They expect a dramatic ending. Handcuffs, courtroom shouting, television cameras. Real life is usually quieter than that, and somehow far more satisfying. Nearly a year passed before I returned to my family's cabin for another long weekend. Autumn had painted the mountains in deep shades of gold and crimson. Fallen maple leaves drifted across the shoreline while a cool breeze carried the familiar scent of cedar, damp earth, and clean lake water. It was the same smell I remembered from childhood. Some things, thankfully, refused to change. I backed my old aluminum boat down the gravel ramp just after sunrise. The trailer groaned exactly the way it always had. My tackle box rested beside me on the passenger seat, its green paint even more chipped than before. Inside, beneath the spare hooks and fishing line, my father's photograph still rested beside my badge exactly where I had left them. I smiled without opening it. I didn't need to. Some reminders work better when they're left undisturbed. The lake greeted me with complete silence. No unauthorized warning signs. No private security patrols. No laminated notices threatening imaginary fines. Families were already scattered along the shoreline. Two brothers skipped rocks near the public dock, while an older couple launched a canoe with the kind of slow teamwork that only comes after decades together. A father helped his young daughter bait her first fishing hook, patiently untangling the line each time she accidentally wrapped it around the rod. Watching them reminded me of my own father standing beside me all those years ago. "Slow down, Ethan," he'd always say. "The lake isn't going anywhere." I eased my boat away from the dock and let the electric motor carry me toward my favorite cove. Halfway there, I noticed another small fishing boat drifting nearby. A boy no older than 10 waved enthusiastically. "Mister," he shouted across the water. "Did you catch anything yet?" I laughed. "Not yet. My grandpa says the big trout hide by the fallen trees." "Your grandpa sounds smarter than I am." The old man sitting beside him tipped his cap. It took me a second to recognize him. Bill Hansen. He grinned the moment our eyes met. "Good to see you back, Ethan." "Good to see you too, Bill." We floated only a few yards apart while the morning sun slowly climbed above the ridge. Neither of us rushed to speak again. Fishermen understand that silence isn't awkward. Sometimes it's the best conversation you'll have all day. Eventually, Bill nodded toward the shoreline. "Different place now." I followed his gaze. Children laughed near the boat launch. Kayaks crossed the lake without interruption. A group of teenagers stood on the public pier comparing tackle boxes, while a park ranger answered questions for visiting tourists. Nobody looked nervous. Nobody looked over their shoulder before casting a line. "Yeah," I said quietly. "Different." Bill smiled. "You know, people still talk about that morning." I figured they might. Most of them don't remember the fine. I looked at him curiously. "No." He shook his head. "They remember you never raised your voice." Those words stayed with me long after we drifted apart. As the afternoon sun warmed the lake, I anchored beside the same weathered dock where everything had begun. I opened my tackle box, tied on an old silver spoon lure my father used to swear by, and cast it toward the shadows beneath a fallen cedar tree. The line barely settled before I felt a sharp tug. The trout fought hard, flashing silver beneath the clear water before finally slipping into my landing net. I admired it for a moment, then carefully removed the hook and lowered it back into the lake. It disappeared with one powerful sweep of its tail, leaving only widening circles across the surface. I watched those ripples fade until the water became perfectly still again. That's the thing about justice. People imagine it's about punishment. Sometimes it is. But the best kind of justice restores something that should never have been taken away in the first place. A family's tradition. A child's first fishing trip. A grandfather teaching patience from the edge of a dock. The freedom to enjoy a public lake without fear of someone pretending to own it. As I packed my gear that evening, I glanced one last time at my father's photograph before closing the tackle box. For a moment, I could almost hear his voice carried across the water by the evening breeze. "Slow down, Ethan. The lake isn't going anywhere. Neither is the truth. It may drift beneath the surface for a while, hidden from sight, but sooner or later it always rises. And when it does, it doesn't need to shout. Because real justice isn't loud. It's patient. It's honest. And in the end, it's inevitable."